Hey folks, I'll be talking about Angular folder structure in this video. So let's talk about why we need a good folder structure. Having a good folder structure has a lot of benefits. One of the first ones being that you don't necessarily have to think about what names of the files you would give as you create newer files in your application. It will be very easy to locate and place files inside your application, and this becomes paramount as your application grows. You have maybe like hundreds of services, hundreds of pages. You need that level of transparency throughout your application so that you can locate things very easily. Also, your application needs to be able to support structures like lazy loading of modules. That becomes very important as your application grows in size. Also, having third-party dependencies in an application is something we cannot avoid. But the folder structure should give you a way to do this very cleanly, so that if you want to replace of the third-party libraries, or if you want to uh, remove them or update them, the breaking changes do not cause cascading changes throughout your application. Now, let's look at a high-level folder structure that I have outlined over here. So over here, you have on a high level inside the source folder, you have the app module folder, you have app module file, you have the app component TS and its related file, the HTML file, the SCSS file, etc. And you also have the first level of routing. Essentially, this is the place you will all define all of the lazy loaded modules. Okay. So other than this, you'll create separate folders. The first folder that you'll create is called core. This will correspond to something called the core module. This will contain all of your services, models, interceptors, guards, and enums, and all of these would essentially be available throughout your application. The next, what you'll have are the feature modules. These correspond to high-level portions of your application that logically group together. Take, for example, login. Login has specific things like sign in, sign up, which are essentially components that people would essentially have relatively um, closeness, or they would be things of a similar nature that you want to group together. And similarly, for individual and admin side, you'll have pages that correspondingly group together. Take, for example, an admin would typically access pages of the admin side, but an individual wouldn't necessarily always access pages of the admin side, or they might not have access to them. So it makes a logical sense to group the individual pages together. So during lazy loading, you're only loading up things that the user needs. That way, the application doesn't load up unnecessary files at a time. Okay. Last thing that we are for last module that we are creating is called a shared folder, which is also corresponding to the shared module. These has things like components, directives, and pipes, which would again be used in all of your feature modules. Let's look closely at each of them. First, you have the core folder. So all of the items which are contained by the core folder contain the core functionalities of the application. These are your services, guards, interceptors, models, and enums. So most of your logic you would want contained inside your services, as well as they would be spread about in certain places like guards, interceptors, etc. You would want this code to be unit tested as cleanly as possible, because this would be used throughout your application, and having problems over here would essentially meet cascading problems throughout your application. Now, as you already know, you often have to deal with third-party dependencies. Maybe take, for example, Moment.js. Everyone used to use Moment.js throughout their application, but Moment.js, as you already know, it got deprecated recently. This was mostly, and the Moment.js size is also quite large. It basically leads to a lot of loading time of your application when the packages are loaded up. It would be better if you replace Moment.js with something equivalent, like maybe say Day.js or date functions. But if think of it, think of this like this: throughout your application, if you have reference to Moment.js, it will be very difficult to cleanly remove it out in a single shot, because it will cause breaking changes throughout the application. How do you do this cleanly? One good way of doing this would be to wrap every method that you use inside your application of Moment.js through a wrapper function inside a service. You can call it something like time zone service, or maybe time service or something. Okay, and this service correspondingly exposes methods of moment so that you can use them throughout the application, but you're only using methods from this service. Now, later on, if you want to remove Moment.js, you just have to make changes inside the service, and the unit test would make sure that nothing breaks. Okay, let's talk about the feature modules. Okay, these folders are essentially portions which correspond to every route which is lazily loaded. Take, for example, login or individual or admin. Inside login, you have these folders which are essentially logically grouped together, or routes which are which are very similar. Take, for example, sign in and sign up. Okay. So the sign in folder would essentially contain the sign in component, and its equivalent and its corresponding the sign in component is the sign in component.html, sign in component.css, and maybe the spec file for unit test corresponding to the given page. Let's talk about the shared module now. The shared module will contain all of your shared components, directives, and pipes. It will also have a module definition which imports all of these. Also, third-party components that you want to load up, you can import in this module and also export them. This way, inside a feature module, if you want to use certain components from these third-party components or your own defined components, you just import the shared module and you will have access to all of these. This will prevent you from unnecessarily avoid importing multiple different modules from these third-party libraries into multiple different shared modules. Third-party components, ideally, you would want to create a wrapper component for inside the shared modules, so that you don't necessarily have to deal with breaking changes anytime you update the component libraries. Take, for example, maybe you're using the grid library from PrimeNG. Now, in a major version change, maybe they completely redefine or restructure what inputs are passed into the grid component. Now, this would mean that any page that uses a grid inside your feature modules, you will have to make changes. This is risky. So if you had a wrapper component for it, you can essentially handle those changes just inside those component, and your whole application one can work as is. Right, and you can effectively isolate your changes into a specific component. Now, a few best practices I'd like to share about how to create shared components inside the shared module. Ideally, all of these components should be presentational components. There are very nice articles written about smart components versus presentational components. It's heavily used in React, but also they are very applicable when you're dealing with Angular. One of the best practices I would mention is essentially avoiding API calls inside shared components. You would want the data to be passed into the components through inputs, and the data to be exposed through outputs. And the smart component should essentially be dealing with all of these. Anytime if you say the component has to change based on certain something, make it react to the input change using the onChanges hook. That would be much more easier and also much more easier to deal with, because you're only dealing with synchronous data at every point of time. In presentational components, avoid having a lot of internal state, because it just makes the application, the particular component much more complicated. So if you feel the component is getting very complicated, it is completely fine to break up the presentational component to further components and essentially spread out the whole logic over multitude of components, so that you can look at one specific component and have it do a singular thing. Also, try to extract out a lot of the application logic from these presentational shared components into services. This will also make sure that that logic is essentially unit tested properly. So all in all, this is a high-level overview of how you define the folder structure for an Angular application. This will scale to a lot of files and a lot of pages, and this has worked on a high level for almost many applications that are dealt with, which deals with almost say hundreds of pages and hundreds of